Merokque by Ari'el, Holland. Chapter 2. How to Hate Everyone. It was so incredibly ironic how I would soon be guarding these people who wanted nothing to do with me. As I walked through the village circle towards the great tent, I heard the whispers of the women and the sniggering of the little boys who called me Yantip, deaf child. Their stares were a mixture of curiously frightened and yet boldly condescending. For some reason I felt tears prick the back of my eyes, but I just steadied my gaze. I had to remind myself that I was only here for these talks, nothing else. I lifted the flap of the tent. Pritam, the village shaman, smiled warmly. "Come, child." I smiled back with a nod. The oldest and most revered member of the tribe was always the shaman. After making a pact to offer his life to the ancestors, he was the one who determined the will of the gods and tested the spirits of other members to see how to proceed with matters of life. For some strange reason, no matter how rejected I was by the tribe, he always somehow remained unfazed by my label or past. I suppose that's why I could sit through these meetings. Although he was short and a little chunky, Pritam's influence was greater than the elders of the tribe, including the chief. All who were present today in the great tent were there to discuss my fate since my father's passing a week ago. They believed I had grieved enough, and now it was time to make hard decisions. I nodded respectfully to the rest of the elders, 4 other elderly men who I wasn't close to, then bent my knee to the new chief, Jujika. "Blessings and honor, my lord," I whispered. But I did not lift my eyes like I knew I was supposed to. I couldn't. I would lash out if I did. So I sat hastily, folding my knees under myself and laying my sweaty hands in my lap. I could feel his silvery gaze observing me in my silent malice. I returned the gaze and I felt my heart quicken at the sight. This was my first time actually facing him like this. Unlike the rest of us in the Charuna tribe, he was unmistakably fair, like a true Fiajuan, with their ghostly complexions, and his eyes were a pale blue-gray that looked like the northern lights were stored in them. They were such a contrast to the dark brown and earthy tones of our people. He had a more lanky frame compared with the bulky, muscular men in our tribe. His features were long and sharp like a wolf. His light brown wavy hair was pulled into a tight warrior's tail that men wore to signify that they were unmarried. He looked nothing like us. I knew very well that Jujika was raised in Charuna as our own, but I also knew his background. He was the bastard child of a Fiajuan rapist who defiled a young girl when my mother and father was still young. My father told me that Jujika was born looking like a pure Fiajuan, grabbing onto the cord between him and his mother with his glistening eyes and pale skin. He too was considered an outcast, till he was found to have a gift that none could explain, a power to heal. His touch could cure sickness and heal wounds. All of a sudden his roots were forgotten and he was taken under Pritam, who raised him as a son alongside his young mother. Then, 2 months ago on his 24th year, he was placed as chief of the village upon the decision of the elders and after the death of our previous chief. He was lauded for his bravery, kindness, selflessness, and godlike abilities that apparently have saved the lives of even dying warriors. But I know very well who his people are. My distance from all the ongoings in the village has made me strong enough to tell. This half-enemy child sat as the leader of our tribe, and my instincts as guardian screamed at the falsity and danger. "Merokque?" Onawe chided. I turned toward the elder. My cheeks burned when I realized I had been staring at Jujika without a word. The room took on a thickness that made me wince. "Child," Pritam soothed, raising his hands, "your father died a guardian and a warrior. We know very well that he had trained you to take after his place, But as you know, traditions will not let a woman guard these walls. Nothing new, I grumbled in my mind. However, we have decided that after much thought, that although you are a woman and an orphan, on our way the village head huntsman began gruffly, and I felt my pulse pound at the words. Jujika raised a sharp hand. The room went stiff as Onawe paused. Will you die for your tribe, Merokque? His voice was like the crackle of a fire, jumping at me with an unexpected heat. Did I need to answer that? But my mouth moved before my head could stop it. Yes, I said. My eyes searched his. They were almost as fair as the moon that I hated so much. Spend a week in the tribe to gain the trust and honor of the people, and then participate in the mating festival. If you are accepted within the circle by the gods, you will be our guardian. What? Just like that? It sounded too easy. It sounded too straightforward. Amazing. Could he just break tradition like that? Years of culture just disintegrated by his words? What does this mean? I murmured, trying to maintain the humility in my voice when all I wanted to do was curse at him for his pig-headedness. I was like, all of a sudden, these strangers had a say in my life simply because I was now an orphan. I was not to be tossed about by tradition or their opinions. I knew who I was born to be, and they know nothing of it. So I waited. Unsurprisingly, the elders seemed reluctant to answer. Jujika just shifted his gaze to the old shaman, who chuckled heartily at my question. You've been away from us long enough, Merokque. Pritam winked in a knowing way as he addressed my shocked state. It means that you'll participate in the mating dance, so you should get yourself ready, as it is only 2 nights away. The mating dance was a yearly ritual, not big or long enough to be considered a festival, but it was certainly important among the youth, possibly the most important event for them. It was a time when they discovered if they would wed that year. It was a time when they found their other halves. On a breezy evening, Pritam would build a huge fire for all the youths who were above 14 and unmarried. There was dancing, singing, and a great display of talents to showcase the abilities of the individuals. They were pitching themselves for marriage, and the whole tribe would watch. I remember how at the final moments, some of the braver ones would proclaim their love for someone in the crowd by slicing their thumb and letting a bit of the blood drip into the fire. If the other person felt the same way, they'd do the same. If they didn't, they would help to bandage the wound. There was a time when I was only 12. I saw a young man proclaim his love, and the girl did the same. Pritam threw a handful of spices into the fire, and it roared with figures and signs that no one could decipher. It is accepted by the gods, Pritam had exulted, smiling at the two. They were married a few weeks after. Every year my father would bring me, and we were only allowed to watch from afar, our senses still locked on the walls and the things that lurked around it. Participation was not something I understood, but this time I would no longer be observing, and I had never felt more out of place. Even Jujika, the Fiejuan bastard, was more of a member of the tribe than I was. I sighed, the weight on my shoulders growing heavier by the minute. I hadn't a clue where to begin in preparing. What was I supposed to wear? What was I supposed to say? What were the steps of the dance? What on earth could I pitch? I was probably more suitable to pitch myself as a man than as a wife at this point. But I couldn't present these questions to them, so I only nodded obediently towards Pritam and then locked my eyes with Jujika for the final time, silver clashing with my amber eyes. The moon meeting the sun as I released the famous parting line and rose from my position. Health and peace be upon you, my lord. He returned the line with a formal nod, and I inhaled deeply, realizing then how shallow my breaths were while I was there. I tilted my head back and looked up at the sky for a moment, the puffy white clouds filling my view as well as fluttering birds zooming across in search of their next meal and home. Oh, to be as free as they are. "Spirits, you look just like your mother," a tender voice said kindly. I lifted my eyes from where I stood, and I saw my aunt, standing a distance from her place in the cookhouse. She knew that I'd be the only one to hear it. Filled with relief, I ran to her and embraced her tightly. She stroked my hair in long, calming strokes. My mother's older sister, Walida, was the main cook of the tribe, a short woman with her hair tied in a long married braid, and her dress made of buffalo skins. Walida was the only way I got to see my mother. Her deep-set hazel eyes and her strong cheeks told me that I was truly her sister's daughter. From my weekly visits to their home, I knew her husband was our prized huntsman, and her eldest son was one of the finest bow makers in the tribe. They were the only ones who cared for me like I was a part of them, and not like I was their bad luck. She whispered a prayer of blessing and comfort over me in hushed tones. I saw how the rest of the women backed away from us slowly, retreating with worried glances at each other. I was still an untamed wolf to them, springing out from the outskirts of the land. I lowered my head at the thought. "Don't pay attention." Walida's voice drew me out of my stupor. "They just don't know how to feel about you yet." Without caring for anything else, Walida filled a bowl with cornbread, meat, and warm soup. I felt instantly nourished and began to explain to her what the elders and chief had told me. She listened with a decisive look on her face, and I didn't know if I was to be assured or worried. "I know just what to do for you, child." Walida told me that I would stay with her till the mating dance happened. I felt my soul tug me back to the walls, but I also knew that they wouldn't let me guard it alone anyway. I had to prove myself first. With an uncanny accuracy, Kian, her husband, returned back from his hunt and informed the family that he would be by the walls with 5 other men till I was restored as the guardian. Restored as the guardian? How long would that take? It might not even happen, I wanted to scoff. Timidly, I weighed the words in my head. It was like saying that place was truly mine to begin with, and it was simply taken by their traditional whims. At that moment, I wanted to speak up and question him further as to why he chose such a strong term to describe what may not even happen. But I recalled that women were not allowed to question men who weren't their husbands, so I swallowed all my words. I had other things to care about anyway, like the fact that I had no idea what to do as an unmarried girl who was about to participate in the mating dance for the first time in my life. It made my cheeks burn every time the thought flashed through my mind. I would be there amongst children, looking like a gasping salmon in a herd of lanky fawns. I would be the brunt of their jokes and conversations for weeks for simply being there. "You're overthinking," Walida chided, pinching my cheek. I grimaced and sighed, falling flat onto her bed of furs. "I can't help it." She clicked her tongue and shuffled through the cloths, wrappings and beads and various feminine items that I knew nothing of. I marveled at how a single person could own so many things just for physical looks. As she busied herself with discovering the perfect outfit for me, I rose from the bed and walked over to the streaky mirror that sat above her clay sink. Father used to say that a hummingbird never changes its feathers, so we too can be simple and embrace our skin. He only had 2 sets of clothing, one for summer and one for winter. Because of how little we moved, we didn't have to change that often, and even if we did, we would walk around in mostly our undergarments as there wasn't anyone around. Even now, I only wore my loose-fitting calfskin tunic with matching shoes. It was a ghastly cream color, but I was covered and that was the only thing that mattered to me. My hair was tied up into a long, feminine version of a wolf tail high on my head, and I wore no jewelry. My skin was golden and cheeks rosy from being in the sun most of the day. My arms toned from swimming in the river and my legs firm from running over hills. I had shoulders as broad as a young man and a core as tight as one too. How would she turn me into a suitable bride? Actually, did I even want to be a bride? All my life I've been beside my father. All my days were spent knowing that I would do what he did as well. But there was no talk of what it meant to be a mother, to be a wife, to be a woman in this tribe that I came from. I was so familiar with my duty that I didn't know how to be the very thing that they were labeling me as. No wonder it sounded like an insult to my ears. I exhaled sharply as the pressure built up in my ribcage. In 2 days I had to make up for 20 years. I splashed a palmful of water on my heated skin and tried to think of something to ask my aunt. But she started first. "I found it." She held up a dress. It was gorgeous, even to my untrained eye. Made of white fur trimmings and an inky blue cloth, the piece was a little dress that was bare on the shoulders and ended slightly above the knee. I swallowed at the thought of going out in that, but Walida stared at it with wet eyes and whispered, "It was your mother's mating dress." I snatched it out of her hands before she could say another word, pressing it close to my chest. I breathed in the heavy scent of the furs and an unknown past. I would never meet this person who gave me life, but I was knowing her through myself and these little gems of time that seemed to be kept just for me. I slid the dress on with shocking ease. It settled on my body as if it were mine, and I stared at the reflection. Surely it couldn't be the same mirror, because I couldn't recognize the person right now. Walida came behind me and choked back a sob behind her fleshy hand. She didn't say a word, only wrapped a bunch of seashell necklaces around my neck and then kissed my cheek softly. I smiled at her gratefully and then took a final look in the mirror. This was the person that was going for the dance. Merokque had to stay behind. I knew very well that the guardian's daughter wouldn't gain the approval of the tribe, but perhaps the daughter of the tribe's greatest dancer would somehow be liked. After trying on the outfit and finally selecting the hairstyle and all the jewelry, the night had fallen. I was shocked at where the time had gone. I requested for a meal, but she denied me, saying that I had to work for my meal. So she brought me to the bathhouse, the village common cleaning area, where the men and women enjoyed saunas and warm baths communally. Once again I found my feet feeling heavier at the sounds of giggles and chattering that grew louder in my ears with each step. I've never bathed in public, I've never shown my body to another human beside my father, and even so, after the moon came, I've always cared for myself alone. My mind stirred. I wanted to tell Walida that you don't get cleaner than bathing under the waterfall and then flee back to the river Sion, forgetting that I even approached the scene. But her hand around my wrist was frighteningly determined. So I concentrated on what I saw before me instead. The old wooden bathhouse was bigger than I had previously imagined. It was separated by a wall for the men and women, but the water was from a common place. It pooled into a square trench that could fit 10 people easily, and I noticed how the coals beneath made the water comfortably warm throughout the night. As we went in further, I noticed all the young, eligible females of the tribe inside. Perhaps 15 to 20 were packed inside like little secrets in the mind of a shaman. They were applying various oils on their hair and body, helping each other to scrub their backs and the calluses of their feet. The heady scents clogged my mind and the steam dulled my fear. "Nakwalida," the girls chimed happily. Nak meant mother. It was a term we used to address married women in the tribe. Walida gave a large, knowing smile to them, and then said, "I have brought Ola Merokque to be prepared for the mating dance." She pushed me forward slightly. Everyone paused their work. I winced slightly at how they ran their eyes over me, and I didn't know how to greet them. I was suddenly raised to being an Ola, which meant older sister. It was a term that I had never heard myself being called. It was something that only those who had gone through the coming-of-age ceremony would be called. I had no such moment in my life, except for when I was attempting to recover from the shooting pains in my core in that cave all alone. They continued to stare in rapt wonder. I knew that most of them were far too young to understand the implications of my presence. It was beyond their young souls, and for that I was thankful. But if there was anything that they couldn't comprehend, it would be how I was so incredibly masculine. And looking at them with their smooth skin, unbound hair, and doe-like eyes, I knew that I was truly a sight to behold. I didn't know if I should begin, or if one of them was going to approach. I just shifted my eyes to Walida cautiously. "Hena," my aunt called firmly, beckoning one of the darker girls over to us. She stood quickly and approached us with a slight timidness that made me curious. Her dark eyes were small and her hair the same tone as tree bark. Everything about her was quaint and simple, but there was something that made me feel instantly connected with her. "Assist Ola," one leader said, smiling at us both. "I need to prepare dinner for the hungry warriors." It took many deep cleansing breaths to finally leave my clothes in the basket and join the rest of them in the pool. They gasped at my physique, probably shocked at how I looked like a man with a woman's face. But Heina only offered me an encouraging glance and then began to undo my hair from its tight confines quietly. I stared down at the cloudy water, unsure how to discuss female matters with her or anyone else in this place, so I just tried to relax and think of questions. "You have beautiful hair," she whispered from behind me. I felt her bony fingers running through my locks and scratching my scalp lightly. No one had complimented me for anything I had, much more in terms of beauty. It emboldened me to try to relate. "Who are your parents?" I tried, hoping that it wouldn't come across as being harsh or invasive. Her fingers stopped their workful heartbeat before continuing. "My mother is a crop gatherer and my father died during the war." Her voice was small. That shame, that silent shame, was something I recognized instantly. I felt it too. It was a strange thing to admit how much less of a person I felt by not having parents to come home to or to bless me in the advance of life. She knew what it felt like. I understood why then, Walida had called her. But I only nodded. I didn't know how to pull all my thoughts into words at this point, but I was beginning to realize that I may not be as alone as I thought I was. Painstakingly and so warmly, Hena had endured the task of washing my hair and coating it with spiced oils till it was glossy and weighty. Tirelessly she went on to scrub my back, the soles of my dry, cracked feet, and my elbows. I had never been cared for in this way, and I wondered why we were supposed to help each other in this way. "Why not just clean yourself?" I had asked, half expecting her to scoff at me. "The ritual begins now. The mating dance has already begun. We start by cleansing ourselves, and it also means to wash away the faults of the past in relationships. If we have done wrong against our sisters, now we can settle it." Hena explained the answer. Her tone held only a firmness and reverence that put me at ease. I took in what she was saying. My wrong was being born, and it was against the entire tribe. How was I to atone for that? I felt the tug of my heart back to the walls, and I realized then that it wasn't about the walls, it was about my father. I only wished to go back because I still expected him to be there, to meet me there, to hear my thoughts and answer my questions. He was the only one I could come to, unafraid and unreservedly. Tears threatened to join the pool of water I was in. I breathed sharply. Her hands stopped. I noticed that though small, they were strong, obviously used to pulling, tugging, and blisters. She gave me a questioning gaze, and I shook my head with as much a smile I could manage, focusing on the scent of the oil and my skin glistening in the moonlight. After many hours, I assumed it was finally over. I slid on my clothes with great relief. Although Hena was a comfort, I felt like a piece of meat being prepared for the roast, slathered with oil, dusted with powders, and rubbed till I was sore. But I did feel, dare I use the word, beautiful. Like I was finally worth looking at, with my supple flesh and shiny hair. I no longer felt like I had walked out from a scuffle on the ground like I usually did, but I felt like I was a treasured bow that had been polished to perfection. Obviously, I wasn't the only one who felt that way. As I walked back to Walida's hut, the voices of the young warriors who were gathered around the dying flame after their nightly dinner reached my ears. "Great spirits, so she is a woman." The young voice was laced with a dryness that made my teeth clench. I didn't know then if I should speed up or slow down. My. And who would have thought that the Guardian was protecting not just the walls, but also this treasure? My heart pounded in my chest. I openly stared at them as they sniggered. "What?" No, 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 you don't want her, Alcaz, one of them barked, louder than the rest. Don't you realize that all she knows how to do is stand and watch a wall? She can't cook, clean, or satisfy a man. His eyes fell on mine and dared me to react. I felt my soul tearing, halves of me screaming to be the daughter of my father and to be the daughter of my mother. The guardian in me saw how easily it was for me to take 2 steps forward with deadly speed. In seconds I'd have unsheathed my knife by his thigh and carved my name on his throat, while shouldering the men beside him with a force that probably would resemble a bear. I stilled my fingers and released my jaw, but my eyes sharpened on his smirk as he eyed my form. They had no idea what I was and what I was raised to be. But before my body could make a decision, an arrow whizzed through the air and pierced itself into the fires. The boys around it jumped in surprise, and a figure came out of the bathhouse with a glare that could still a storm. His wet locks were tied in loose bun at his nape, and he only wore his leather pants, so I saw how his body was still dripping wet and rippling with muscles. His broad frame reminded me of my father, and he wasn't that much taller than I was. But his presence was commanding, and I knew that he was much older than the rest, probably already married with a family, from the lines under his eyes and the way that they retreated from his presence. I too was stilled when he shifted his eyes to the one who stared at me. The young offender visibly shrank into the ground as the older man approached him, hissing through gritted teeth into the boy's ear. I should tell Pritam about this sort of behavior during the cleansing ritual and have you banned from participating. I saw how the boy's throat tightened, and he shook his head quickly. Pardon my wrongs, Allah Nadil. Nadil, the bowmaker of the tribe. He was Nadil? Great spirits, this was Walida's own son, my maternal cousin. I felt slightly guilty at how I couldn't recognize him. He had aged so much, and I had hardly interacted with him as he had left to be an apprentice in another tribe when I was still a child. Nadil clicked his tongue and gestured towards me with his chin. The frightened boy dipped his head low in a mark of humility. I inclined my head to him with a stern look before continuing to walk. I hurried off with heated skin. I didn't know what to make of that moment earlier. I had never been lusted over by a man so openly, and neither have I ever been protected by one in this way. Father and I never had to deal with anyone else other than ourselves when we were at the war, and the worst we ever encountered were wolves or the occasional bandit. Deep, heavy breaths. My chest felt tight and loose at the same time my blood was cold in my veins. I could hear footsteps behind me, and I turned to see Nadil, far behind but following after me carefully. He was as light-footed as a deer. He glanced at me for a heartbeat, and then lowered his gaze and immediately took another path. I wanted to call out to him to thank him for earlier, but I remembered quickly that Hena had mentioned the fact that all the unmarried boys and girls were meant to be separated till the actual mating dance. I felt breath catch in my throat. That meant Nadil was still unmarried. He was still a part of the mating dance process. By the time I had gathered myself, the glorious scent of meat and roasted corn filled my senses. Walida seemed visibly pleased at my cleaned-up state, and asked me nothing else for the rest of the night, for which I was grateful, because I couldn't think of anything else other than stuffing myself till I couldn't taste anymore, and arrows flying through the air. The morning hadn't begun, but the hollering in ancient chants and hoofs thudding into the earth woke me. I lifted the flap of the teepee and saw the young men gathering together on horses. They were dressed in their warrior outfits with all the weapons of the tribe adorning their backs, thighs, and horses. I quickly spotted Chijika with his chief's headdress and body marked with paint. He yelled out a deafening call for war and blood before leading all the young men behind him into the forest at a terrifying speed. I saw how their thin and childish frames bounced in the saddles as they disappeared in the thick of the trees. As I got out of my tent, I noticed how Nadil was the last man, following after the great leader and all the small boys with his bow and arrow. Hena found herself by my side. She held the scent of the spices we were soaking in the night before, and she seemed strangely defeated. Looking at me with a wistful smile, she sighed. Now it's our turn. They will go to hunt the largest animal they can find by nightfall, and we will have to gather enough crops to outweigh their animal in competition. I laughed out loud. That's absurd. Hena only stood quietly, and I looked across the field, realizing that they were each holding a large basket and a hat for the scorching heat that will soon descend on everyone. How are we going to gather enough corn and roots to outweigh a deer or a bear? Hopefully they will only find rabbits and squirrels, one of the girls laughed, and the rest giggled at the thought. Hena handed me a basket and a hat. It was going to be a long day. To say that my hands were sore would be a joke. I turned my hands over to look at the redness that came from just plucking, pulling, and plowing through layers and layers of weeds to get to the crops. I grit my teeth and clenched my fist. Conditioning is the first step on the path of being a warrior. My father drilled this into me. He said that your body has to understand what is normal, so that when you experience it in a sudden situation, you wouldn't freeze up. I was trained to take a hit, a solid, heavy one. But these fine details with corn silk and choosing the right tubers from the ground was something else. I stood close to Hena and observed how she moved, with an ease that made me feel inadequate as to what I was supposed to be. This was the world of the women of the tribe. This was what I was expected to excel in. But now I was here, bending over in the heat and pulling out potatoes from the soil and feeling completely ungraceful. I hissed in frustration and rolled my shoulders slowly. "Are you all right, child?" An older voice crept from beside me. I turned quickly and saw the woman who the whole tribe now venerated, Jujika's mother, the defiled youth from the fray of yesteryears. I don't remember ever interacting with her, but at this distance I could tell that the slim shape of her light green eyes and her tall nose was certainly given to Jujika. I didn't know how to feel at that second. Unfortunately, my mouth moved. "I'm fine, Nakiara." I stood where I was, believing she would step away and continue her work, but she took a step forward and her eyes were wet. "I never got to offer my sadness for your father's death," she whispered. "He did so much for our tribe." I blinked back the sudden rush of tears. Yes, I wished to scream it. He truly did. My eyes followed the careful movement of her fingers as they touched my forehead, lips, and heart in a smooth motion, the gesture of sympathy, solidarity, and honest pain. Against my better judgment and all the feelings that welled up in enmity towards this situation, I kissed her knuckles before she could pull away completely. It was something only the closest people would do, but I knew that she had touched the closest thing to my heart, and for that I could look past anything for just a little while. Before either of us could say anything else, I heard the familiar sound of dead leaves crunching beneath light footsteps, and I inhaled deeply towards the wind, observing how oblivious the rest of the women were. At my sudden alertness, Giara gave me a worried glance. "Mountain lions," I whispered. "A few of them. They're close by." Should I tell the rest? She seemed calm, but I saw the panic rising in her aged eyes. I trained my senses on the closest one, and I turned to see its sly form creeping from behind the trees towards one of the smallest girls. It would just take a single leap for it to grab her by the shoulder and drag her into the forest. Hoping Giara would forgive me, I darted towards the scene and screamed at the little girl, "Move inside." Her head perked up at my shout, and she stood slowly. I gestured for her to move, but the huge creature reeled back in preparation, and I knew she didn't have a clue, so I shoved her away and the mountain lion snarled as it landed on me. Its claws sank into my shoulder and its massive jaws were inches away from my neck before I elbowed it in the eye. It fell to the side with a harsh growl. Quickly I drew the knife from my thigh and hissed loudly at it. It began to circle me, licking its lips at the blood flowing down my arm. I made the first move and it returned the action. The jump it made to me was deadly, its weight almost as much as me as I tackled it to the ground and stretched my arm under its belly. My knife sank into its side. It whined loudly, swinging its claws in a final attempt, but I twisted the weapon and it stilled. I let the body drop to the ground with a loud thud. Around the area I felt the rest of the pack retreating in fear. The The field was safe. At that moment, the rush of danger left my body and the dizziness took its place. My knees buckled and I saw the red streaks run down my fingers onto the soil. The dead body of the huge mountain lion lay before me. I never had to kill an animal like this before. Often father's voice and torches would be enough, because they knew the difference between prey and predator. I've only seen him scare them away. Guilt, shock, and amazement filled my soul as my body weakened. Breathe, Merokque. I tried to stand, but I wobbled slightly. Merokque! Walida gasped from behind me, grabbing my elbow. She hoisted me up sharply, and I wouldn't allow myself to be weak at this point. Not when all the women were watching how I would keep them safe or not. I couldn't give them a chance to think that I couldn't complete my work. I'm fine, I whispered to her. She shook her head and muttered some obscenities under her breath as she guided me towards the center of the field. There they wrapped my shoulder with a clean cloth and gave me a drink with a spoonful of honey. Instantly my mind cleared, but my body began to throb with pain. The scars, for this might be the worst I've ever had. I winced at the thought. As the women fussed over me, I brushed the injury aside. Walida announced that we would return earlier as I needed rest. I instantly felt regretful and responsible for ruining the event, but some girls started chattering excitedly. Hena came forward with the widest smile I'd ever seen on her face. Not Walida. I think with the puma Merokque killed, we'll definitely win. As the older woman grinned at the thought, a sense of triumph that filled the field was greater than all the pain I could have had for the whole day. End of chapter 2.